About a third of the North American NES library uses MMC3. This mapper switches both the program and character ROMs at a much finer granularity than discrete mappers or MMC1. This allows detailed animation of both backgrounds and sprites while letting more subroutines read maps and other large data tables. It also has a timer that counts scan lines drawn by the PPU. This timer makes some visual effects easier to pull off, such as status bars and parallax scrolling. First, I wrote down a list of registers. MMC3 has a few more registers than other mappers I've implemented. It also has a seek and write interface like Action 53, but only for the program and character banks. Mirroring, RAM enable, and the timer have dedicated addresses. To use the timer, a program writes how many scan lines to wait. The MMC3 uses the written value as a reload value. This means that after the current countdown ends, the MMC3 sets the reload value as the length of the next countdown. Another pair of registers tells whether to interrupt the CPU when the countdown is ending. When the CPU is interrupted, it needs to acknowledge the interrupt by turning it off and back on. The program can schedule a reload for the end of this scan line. Manual reload is the biggest difference between the MMC3 timer and the horizontal interrupt in the Master System in Genesis. Over the course of building MMC3, my mental model of its timer would evolve, including which shortcuts are and aren't valid. I built the seek and write interface for selecting ROM banks. MMC3 has 8 windows, 6 for character and 2 for program. I needed to rebuild the mapping for whatever was written. The seek register has 2 other functions. One swaps the address of small and large character windows, and the other swaps part of the fixed program bank with Windows 6. When one of these functions changed, I needed to rebuild the mapping. The timer counts scan lines by watching PPU address line 12. This line usually activates when the PPU fetches sprite patterns. If it's been 3 CPU cycles since the last sprite pattern fetch, MMC3 assumes it's a new scan line. The emulated mapper counts 1 cycle for each read or write. I sketched the timer mostly as a placeholder. The initialization routine needed to set default mappings. If a mapper has switchable nametable arrangement, some emulators take the initial value from the INES header. Because actual hardware isn't quite as predictable, most games initialize nametable arrangement at startup. The last 8K of address space is fixed to the last 8K of program ROM. Startup code has to go there because the rest can be switched out, and the game would have no way to switch it back in. Windows 0 and 1 each control 2K of PPU memory. Windows 2 through 5 each control 1K. Normally it uses large windows for the background and small windows for sprites. Inverting PPU address bit 12 swaps these. I'd sketched out much of the functionality, and all I had to do was make it compile so I could test it. I started Holy Mackerel, and the emulator crashed. I needed to expand the mapper struct to hold MMC3's larger state. Back to the headless front end to log what was going on. It looked like it was booting. I tried ROMs of other sizes. It gave error code 2010. I looked up what that means. First digit 2 meant SRAM couldn't be set to read-only, and third digit 1 meant there wasn't a timer yet. Another MMC3 test booted with garbled graphics because it needed the timer. I'd save that test for later and look for other tests. 240p Test Suite started up, but then it doesn't rely on much. I tried Full Quiet, an exploration platformer by Retrotainment Games. It worked, apart from parallax foregrounds being broken due to no timer. I completed the whole first area. I could sense that the timer would be time-consuming. Before adding timer interrupts, I wanted a solid foundation. This meant handling the handful of opcodes that NESTest doesn't test. So I decided to run Blarg CPU tests. I took notes on 10 unofficial opcodes that failed, as well as the break instruction that's crucial for interrupt handling. I needed to triage them, decide which to do now and which after timer. Yo dog, I heard you like to break, so I set a breakpoint on break. I vaguely remembered a bug in the 6502 when NMI happens during break. I reminded myself to look up the details later. I looked at what break was doing in a good emulator and in my emulator. I played Spot the Difference between trace logs. It took me 8 minutes. One inconvenient thing about Blarg's tests is use of checksums. Instead of running each step and comparing output after each step, it runs all the steps and runs a CRC checksum over the output. If the checksum differs, something went wrong, but it can't tell what. Checksum use means even reading the test's source offers few hints. I did get one hint. It was checking the processor status, and I had forgotten to disable interrupts and break. Success! That made the test pass. I had been developing a test ROM for a different console. It tests several behaviors that older emulators get wrong. I strive to make the tests as clear as possible to make it easier for emulator developers to fix the inaccuracy. This means no obfuscation and no checksums. After this, I wasn't in the mood to work on the timer, so I decided to bang out some unofficial opcodes starting with two 2-byte no operations. Down to 6. Off to look up what the others do. NESDevWiki documents some, but not all, unofficial opcodes. It appears to focus on those that could be useful in actual games. I took notes on the documented ones. SHX and SHY looked weirder. Anything involving the so-called H register is probably less stable. Little did I know at the time that my notes were nowhere near complete. One of the instructions was just AND, then copying bit 7 to carry. 2 more down, 4 to go in that test. An AND with a shift, like a group 3 read modify write but backward. AND with register X and subtract a value. This one looked convenient for stepping through arrays. 2 more down, 2 to go. One is another AND with shift. I remembered that this last one was hairy. With 6 minutes left, was it worth it? I added placeholders for the instructions I saw as unstable and saved them for later. I prepared to put more logging in the MMC3's timer so I could start on that first thing in the new year. Rabbit, rabbit! It was the first of the month! And nobody replied to my emulator announcement on social, 1 like each on Blue Sky and the SNS formerly known as Twitter, a bunch more likes on Mastodon, and even 1 boost. I guessed it was way too early in development for serious engagement. I marked the new opcodes as unofficial. Time for the timer. I made the PPU inform the mapper of video memory reads and writes, including the part of a palette write visible on the address bus. I chose a test ROM and added logging for the timer. Only a rising edge on PPU address bit 12 is supposed to clock the timer. I logged every such edge. It was seeing edges on the pre-render scan line. The filtering to ignore all but 1 rise per line wasn't working. I logged each frame's first reload request. The filter wasn't being allowed to drain out while A12 was low. This looked a bit better. The countdown was ending. I needed to specify what to do. This meant giving the mapper a way to interrupt the CPU. I initialized the IRQ line at power-up and had the mapper control it. Then I started on the CPU. But why were the interrupts landing in the pre-render line? Manual loads aren't supposed to cause an interrupt. I tried another approach. That was still not it. I began separating the reloading from the interrupt. I was seeing it cause an IRQ halfway down as expected, and that caused my test ROM to look okay. But what about a real game, like Haunted Halloween 86 or 87? I turned off MMC3 timer logging and turned on the SDL front end. Title screen looked okay, that's a good sign. Parallax scrolling looked slightly glitchy, but not wrong enough to make the game unplayable. I made it through the whole prologue of Haunted Halloween 87. The glitches I saw at the end yesterday had a reason. The MMC3's timer was waiting 1 more line than expected, and it compounded over the course of a frame. I ran my test in a good emulator and jotted down the expected timing for the interrupt. Some of the difference lay in how the 2 programs expressed times. Messen printed the dot when the mapper requested the interrupt. My emulator printed the dot when the interrupt handler started running. I realized MMC3 was asserting its interrupt 1 line before reloading. I needed to separate reloading from the interrupt even further. Maybe an interrupt happens when the counter is 0 right after a clock. This looked promising. It also meant video memory reads in the pre-render line had to be correct. It'd take me a while to figure out what the heck was going on. I confirmed the timing difference by logging interrupt vector reads. This new interpretation also made Haunted Halloween 87's title screen look okay, yet everything after the title screen was 1 line off. Sometimes. Full quiet had the same one-line jitter. It wasn't as apparent in Haunted Halloween 86 because of how that game uses background tiles. The timer was better than before, but not perfect. I added 2 different levels of detail for MMC3 timer logging. I redirected the log to a file so I could study it later. Something was causing the timer over an entire frame to be 1 line late. I added more logging for the pre-render line. Something was suspicious near the start of pre-render horizontal blank. I could see the PPU address for sprite fetches. Frames when the timer was late had no sprite fetches in pre-render. I narrowed the logging to just the first sprite fetch. This misbehavior wasn't in the mapper, it was in the PPU. I logged secondary OAM during pre-render. Secondary OAM turned out to be empty on late lines. Because 8x16 pixel sprites can use tiles from either pattern table, an MMC3 program has to explicitly use odd tile numbers so that the fetch comes from the second pattern table. Otherwise, the timer might confuse it with the background fetch, causing it to count a line more than once or not at all. Here, secondary OAM had even tile numbers. This caused the PPU to read the background pattern table in pre-render, in turn causing the MMC3 to miss sprite fetch and not count the line. There are indeed sprites with tile 0, but they're off-screen, so why were they getting fetched? I needed to make the PPU stop trying to make tile 0 fetch happen.